In the mid-1990s, the world was waking up to the power of the internet.
Can you explain what internet is?
On the internet,
the internet right now.
The internet and the web, it's going to be huge.
What the internet is going to do to society is unimaginable.
Most people didn't understand it. They just knew the world was changing. The only question was how. As the internet grew, big companies and governments tried to clamp down on internet freedom, monitoring calls, tracking searches, logging every click and every keystroke. But there was one person who stood in the way: Len Sassaman, a young cryptographer with a mind like a supercomputer. His mission was to make freedom and privacy fundamental parts of the internet. In just 10 years, he helped revive the Cypherpunk movement, strengthen the open source community, and build tools that protect millions of people. The internet you use today, safe, open, and free, exists largely because of Len Sassaman, the anonymous cypherpunk who took on the most powerful forces in the world. And yet, almost no one knows his name. Toward the end of the 1990s, personal computers were exploding in popularity. Suddenly, millions of people had a portal into the World Wide Web, right in their own homes. One of those people was a young Len Sassaman. Born in Pennsylvania in 1980, Len grew up in a modest family. His parents didn't have much, but they always supported his interests in technology. As a teenager, Len became a self-taught computer scientist. He spent countless hours browsing online communities, learning how to code, and surrounding himself with other technology enthusiasts who were not just learning about the internet, but actually building it. You see, most kids learn programming so they can make computer games or create websites, but not Len. He didn't see the internet as his personal playground. Long before most other people, he understood and respected it for what it really was: a boundless ecosystem with the power to revolutionize the world, if it remained in the hands of those willing to protect it, to keep it free. Year by year, Len saw how the internet was taking shape, and he became absolutely obsessed with the ideas of digital security, internet freedom, and cryptography. As it turns out, he wasn't the only one who cared. In the early 90s, a group of online cryptography enthusiasts who called themselves cypherpunks started a movement with a simple yet daunting mission: to protect the internet from all threats, surveillance, censorship, and centralized control. And their help was sorely needed. You see, the internet, by default, began as open source. Code was shared freely, collaboration was constant, and transparency was the norm. To early internet adopters, this was a paradise. But unfortunately, it did not stay that way for long. During the dot-com boom, tech companies like Cisco, Netscape, and Yahoo were growing like never before. Suddenly, thousands of internet freedom activists were lured away from the cause by the promise of high salaries and stock options. So instead of protecting personal privacy and freedom, some of the brightest minds from the cypherpunk movement shifted to building empires that sold personal data for ad revenue. The cypherpunk movement began fading into obscurity, leaving digital rights unprotected. Suddenly, governments were increasingly surveilling the web, tech giants were gatekeeping their software, and debates over the right to private communication were heating up. Watching from his bedroom, 18-year-old Len Sassaman had a decision to make. He was a computer prodigy. It's not hard to imagine him receiving scholarship opportunities from top universities and the lucrative career that likely awaited him in the tech world. But on the other hand, how could he spend a single minute studying when there was so much work to do? If freedom and privacy weren't baked into the internet from the start, then by the time he graduated, it'd be too late. Plus, at the same time, Len had to support his family financially, so he defied the traditional path and didn't go to college. Instead, he wasted no time getting involved in the fight for internet freedom. Fresh out of high school, he became a contributing member of the Internet Engineering Task Force, a volunteer organization that was building some of the early internet's core infrastructure. Even when it felt like everyone else had abandoned their principles, Len was working tirelessly and thanklessly. But at the same time, he knew that it wasn't enough. Len had the brains and he had the passion, but in order to build an open and free internet, he needed help, and he was willing to turn his entire life upside down to find it. Len knew that if anybody could build the internet right, it was these cypherpunks, the ones who originally fought for its freedom. The only problem was, the movement had pretty much faded out. The only place where it was still active now and then was San Francisco. Now, most 19-year-olds would have been terrified to leave their family behind, move across the country, and start over in an unfamiliar place. But Len was not most 19-year-olds. When he got to San Francisco, he dove into the cryptography movement, recruiting a fresh generation of people to take up the cause of digital safety, and he was making an impact. Other cypherpunks began to take notice of this young, ambitious programmer whose grasp on cybersecurity was far beyond his years. But while many cryptographers focused on conducting academic research and writing essays, Len took a different approach to internet privacy. He didn't deal in hypotheticals, and theories weren't all that important to him. What mattered to Len was producing real software that real people would use, not just research papers. This core belief that technology was only useful if it was practical and accessible inspired him to build tools to put power where it belonged, in the hands of the people. Within just a few months, Len caught the attention of Lance Cottrell, the founder of a small scrappy startup called Anonymizer. Even in the early days of the internet, Lance understood the need for privacy and security on the web. So he built a company that offered some of the first online anonymity services. Not only did Anonymizer hide users' IP addresses, it also did not keep any records of their online activities at all. So even if the authorities asked for any user data, they'd walk away empty-handed. It was like incognito browsing on steroids. Now, Anonymizer wasn't just for people who had something to hide. Victims could report crimes without fear of retaliation. Whistleblowers could expose corruption and wrongdoing. Journalists could communicate with sources without government surveillance. In these cases, anonymity was protection. It was freedom. Lance gave Len one of his first real opportunities to prove himself after he came to California. He began working as a system engineer at Anonymizer, playing a vital role in keeping the internet a safe place for all. At its peak, Anonymizer had over 1 million users, and yet again, that wasn't enough. If Len really wanted to bring internet freedom to as many people as possible, he'd have to do something bigger than a computer program. He would have to start a movement. Len didn't have a blueprint for how to build a global internet freedom movement, but he took full advantage of the two resources at his disposal. First of all, Len was already friends with people who would go on to become some of the most legendary activists and cryptographers in the world. His roommate, for example, was working on a radical new peer-to-peer file-sharing protocol that eventually became BitTorrent. Len was also friends with the future co-founder of Tor. Working with them during those early years gave Len a front row seat to what the future of the internet might look like: decentralized, open, and free. And secondly, Len lived in San Francisco, the epicenter of the tech scene, and one of the ways Len met new people in the industry was technology conferences. But most of the time when he attended one, he left feeling empty. Tickets to these conferences cost hundreds, if not thousands of dollars, and yet, to Len, they were filled with nothing more than just flashy or formal academic presentations with little substance. Where were the panel discussions with the best and brightest minds? The demonstrations of new, groundbreaking, and actually useful security programs? Len started to think that there had to be a better way. In fact, he was sure of it. He envisioned a family of technology conferences that weren't all fluff and theory, where computer scientists could conduct software show and tells, developers would debut actual working prototypes, and fellow tech activists could hear programmers speak about their newest privacy tools and cryptographic applications. Together with his friends, Len went on to start 2 different tech conferences. Hot Pets, which was meant for people showcasing privacy-enhancing technologies, and CodeCon, which was a broader conference for technology enthusiasts. The first CodeCon took place in 2002 after months of planning and preparation. Word began spreading in the Bay Area about this new kind of technology event, so activists and developers began showing up to unveil their projects as well as debate ethical subjects around computer science and technology. And of course, Len was in the middle of it all, leading discussions, sharing his expertise, and proposing new ideas. Soon it was clear that Len hadn't just started a conference, he built a community, a small yet passionate group of people coming together to solve digital security problems and build the future of technology together. However, CodeCon wasn't just a professional success for Len, it was personal too. It's where he met Meredith Patterson, a brilliant computer scientist and cryptographer who not only shared his passion for cybersecurity, but would become one of his closest collaborators. Together, Len and Meredith tackled some of the most complex problems in digital privacy and encryption. The two were intellectual equals, creative partners, and co-conspirators in building a freer internet. However, Meredith wasn't just part of Len's mission, she was his romantic partner. In true hacker fashion, Len proposed to her at the 5th annual CodeCon, but instead of pulling out a ring, he wrapped a blue Ethernet wire around her finger, the kind used for connecting computers to the internet. They were married 6 months later.
I met Meredith last year. She presented a bioinformatics talk at CodeCon, and we've developed a really good friendship over the last year, and a long road trip over Christmas. I met her family, and I decided this is what I want.
But while Len and Meredith were building their future together, another threat to internet freedom was brewing. And this time, it wasn't something Len could fight from behind a screen. If Len wanted to see real justice, he'd have to take to the streets. In 2001, Dmitry Sklyarov, a lone Russian programmer, was in the fight of his life against one of the biggest software companies in the world, with the full force of the federal government coming down on him. The software giant Adobe was pioneering e-book technology, and they had already developed a popular format for them. However, the functionality of their software was quite limited, and it had a lot of unnecessary restrictions. Dmitry wanted to make it easier for people to read electronic books, so he created a program that allowed users to take ebooks out of Adobe's proprietary system and turn them into PDF files. Users loved the program Dmitry created. With it, they could freely share just about any ebook, make backup copies, convert them into different formats, and use screen readers to access the materials. It had more features and was easier to use than Adobe's version. But of course, Adobe wasn't a fan, and neither was the FBI. In July, Dmitry was arrested for trafficking in circumvention technology, aiding and abetting, and conspiracy. The prosecution and the defense fought over who had the right to own digital information and just how far that right went. But beneath all the legal complexities and arguments over intellectual property lay one single question: is code a crime? To Len and a few hundred of his friends, the answer was a resounding no. To them, code wasn't just a tool, it was a form of expression, and naturally, it deserved protection under the First Amendment. So, Len wasn't just fighting for Dmitry, he wanted to establish a fundamental principle that code is speech. This wasn't just about ebooks, it was about freedom. And to the government's surprise, millions of others agreed. Dmitry quickly gained public support after his case was publicized. His case gained international attention as people saw the government as grossly overstepping its bounds and persecuting a man who had clearly not violated any copyright laws. If Dmitry lost this case, it could affect everyone who believed in digital freedom. Len couldn't just stand on the sidelines and watch this happen, so he took an active role. He wasn't just in the crowd of people protesting Dmitry's arrest, he was actually organizing the protests, leading the charge against the injustice that, to him, cut at the very heart of his life's mission. And it worked! Months later, even Adobe backed down from the case and recommended that Dmitry be released. After hearing the news about this, Len told a reporter at a demonstration, "This is a good first step, but I'm not going to rest easy until Dmitry is free." You see, even despite Adobe's recommendation, the federal government was hell-bent on prosecuting Dmitry. If convicted, he was facing up to 25 years in prison. The case went to trial, but eventually, Dmitry was acquitted of the charges. The jury agreed that writing the code and selling the software that allowed people to have better access to Adobe's ebooks wasn't criminal. The outcome was victorious, but seeing a fellow programmer with similar ideals being so brazenly targeted radicalized Len. The case sent a haunting message to him. Open source software was under attack. In Len's eyes, there was nothing more shameful than putting a paywall in front of progress. What good was knowledge if it was locked behind a patent or proprietary system? He believed that code wasn't just an expression of free speech. It was free speech itself. Len might not have set out to be a political activist, but he couldn't sit idly by while censorship took over and privacy rights were trampled. The outcry against Dmitry's arrest was intense, but it didn't last long. Because just a few weeks later, Len's attention and the world's turned to a catastrophic event that would make all previous government surveillance programs look like child's play. By the early 2000s, the US government were experts at monitoring communication channels. Faxes, phone calls, and emails were never truly private. But this brought up an interesting dilemma for Len. Of course, he always supported whistleblowers and activists who spoke out against injustices or abuses of power. But he also knew the government has a legitimate need to keep people safe, and he didn't want to intervene with that. When it came to the government and their use of technology, he just wanted to ensure that they acted within the bounds of the law. However, those ideals were about to be tested like never before. Len had no clue what was coming. In fact, no one did. Until one late summer morning when terror rained down from the skies. On September 11th, 2001, 2 hijacked planes were crashed into the World Trade Center in New York City. A third was crashed into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and yet another was flown into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, just a few hours from where Len grew up. Thousands of Americans perished in the 9/11 attacks, and the global war on terrorism that dominated the next decade began immediately. Out of the chaos came one of the most controversial, most sweeping pieces of legislation in United States history.
It's now my honor to sign into law the USA Patriot Act.
Now, Len wasn't naive to the reality of government surveillance. He'd seen what had happened in the case of Dmitry Sklyarov, and that was over ebooks. But this was terrorism. Under the Patriot Act, the federal government bestowed upon itself the right to surveil and spy on any American at any time for any reason. Or even for no reason at all. It was a level of intrusion unlike anything ever seen before, and Len was horrified. As more and more people began to see the need for digital privacy, Anonymizer, the company Len worked for, grew rapidly. The demand was so overwhelming that they had to scale insanely fast, rolling out an entire suite of online privacy tools for secure online browsing in just months. In 2002, Yahoo even named Anonymizer one of the 50 most useful sites on the internet. And that's because Len's work mattered more than ever. Not just to activists, whistleblowers, and political dissidents. Millions of everyday people just wanted to use the internet without being spied on by their own government, as was their right. but because of the Patriot Act, they couldn't. Len was really concerned. He considered this a total abuse of power. In his words, the quest for knowledge is a fundamental part of being human, and any kind of prior restraint against that is, in my opinion, a violation of our freedom of thought. But even though he was going against the US government, he wasn't going to let the internet become a tool for state surveillance. So, he got to work like never before. In the years after 9/11, Len's commitment, work ethic, and productivity kicked into overdrive. During this time, he was working like a machine, constantly contributing to open source projects, building more fundamental encryption technologies, and even supporting early Tor development. Len often used a pseudonym to publish his work, so he didn't even get credit for much of it. And when he couldn't find a solution to a digital privacy dilemma, he'd code it into existence. For example, in 2009, Len, his wife Meredith, and a colleague discovered a way to get fake security certificates and impersonate other websites. This issue was baked into some of the internet's core infrastructure, so if anyone else found it, they could do untold damage. Thankfully, Len pointed out the issue and offered a solution before anything bad happened, and this led to multi-billion-dollar companies and governments upgrading their security systems to prevent attacks. In the end, this laid the foundation for safe and trustworthy online payment systems, which was a huge leap for the internet. Also around this time, Len started working for the online protection company Network Associates, helping to build a revolutionary type of encryption technology called Pretty Good Privacy, which uses a public-private key infrastructure to make sure communication is safe and anonymous. By this point, Len was one of the most well-known figures within the cypherpunk movement. Apart from working, he spent a lot of time teaching others about cybersecurity, which of course was a pretty niche community. However, even though few outside of the scene had any idea who he was, Len's next project was about to affect billions of lives. You see, every single day, billions of emails are shared over the internet. The sheer volume of communication is astounding, but at its core, it's a pretty straightforward process. Messages go directly from point A to point B, usually with the identities of both the sender and the receiver on full display. For most people, that system is good enough. But what happens when there's much more at stake? When privacy and security are matters of life and death? When it's political activists coordinating protests and rebellions, or journalists communicating with government informants? One leaked message or exposed identity could set off a chain reaction of persecution, prison, or something much worse. These are the people whose very lives depend on digital safeguards, so the only solution for them is total anonymity. Len knew how important a tool like this was, but if he was going to build it, it had to be ironclad. No matter how skillful the hacker or what threats came from the authorities, the system should be impenetrable. Now, building a tool like this would have been a daunting project at any time, but with the Patriot Act now looming over digital rights, there was the potential for severe life-changing consequences. However, Len wasn't afraid, and his old boss Lance wasn't either. Once again, they collaborated on a technology called Mixmaster, and it would come to define Len's legacy. You see, typical messaging protocols are easy to track because they transfer messages directly from sender to receiver, and often, messages are unencrypted. But Mixmaster was a remailer, which meant it used a completely different approach. Instead of taking messages straight from point A to point B, it funneled them through a complex web of computers called remailers. When sending a message, Mixmaster wrapped it in several layers of encryption, kind of like putting a letter inside multiple envelopes, each headed to different addresses. The message went to the first remailer, which opened the outer envelope and sent it to the next remailer in the network. That one did the same thing, then the third, and so on. At each stop, one layer was peeled away, and details about where the message came from were removed. So, by the time the message reached its final destination, any information that could link it back to the original sender was gone. That's how Mixmaster protected people's identities. Even if someone intercepted the message along the way, they'd have no way to figure out where it came from or who received it, because the program made it impossible. Mixmaster was revolutionary, and it attracted a lot of people. But its true value wasn't just the service it provided, it was the foundation that it set. In the coming years, other cryptographers used Mixmaster as the basis to create even more advanced and secure online anonymity systems. Len had paved the way for other decentralization technologies to take hold at the time when communication was most vulnerable to the prying eyes of power. The new landscape of state surveillance ushered in by the Patriot Act might have scared away other programmers, but not Len. He had the crucial role of serving as Mixmaster's sole maintainer. This meant he personally ensured that the program ran as intended and kept all communication private and secure. To him, every anonymous message in the endless stream of bits flowing through the Mixmaster represented a voice speaking out without fear. But most of the countless people who relied on Mixmaster to communicate anonymously didn't even know that Len was behind it all, and he was committed to this mission until the very end. For a man who staked his life on internet privacy, Len was not afraid to be seen on the front lines of digital security, but he didn't do it for fame or glory. What compelled Len was his unshakable belief that the internet should be free and open for everyone. He wasn't shy about his work, but what he did keep from everyone was his nearly lifelong battle with depression and anxiety. On July 3rd, 2011, Len was staying in Belgium, where he was a PhD candidate and researcher. His wife, Meredith, had been messaging with him from the United States, and out of nowhere, he stopped responding. Meredith asked a friend who flew to Belgium to check on him, but sadly, by that point, it was too late. Len passed away by his own hand at the age of 31. As news spread online, hundreds of tributes poured in from old friends from CodeCon, former co-workers, and even fellow tech activists who only knew him digitally. Len's death marked the end of an era on the internet. One of the architects of the World Wide Web was gone, but not before he ensured it was a more open and free place for everyone. Many of the safety and security protocols people take for granted on the internet today are the direct result of Len's devotion to making sure they had an unrestricted online experience. In many ways, he was ahead of his time, but Len proved to be the man for the moment. He often didn't take credit, and sometimes he'd work anonymously if it meant the chance to serve the greater good. So the true scope of Len's contributions may never be fully known. But in the years since his death, more information has been revealed. Dots are starting to be connected. And it's leaving many to ask who Len really was. (2008) 2008 was a year of absolute chaos in the finance world. Banks that were deemed too big to fail collapsed, mortgage defaults soared as desperate homeowners lost their jobs, and the government rushed to bail out institutions to preserve the dollar's tanking value. People were watching their livelihoods fall victim to corporate greed and corruption. So, as the markets were in meltdown, it seemed like the perfect time for a complete overhaul of the traditional financial system. If ever there was a time for a revolution, it was now. And someone on a cryptography mailing took it upon themselves to make that happen. A few months into the financial crisis, a paper about a peer-to-peer electronic cash system began to circulate. The author, an anonymous user calling themselves Satoshi Nakamoto, laid out a vision for a new kind of currency. One that didn't rely on big banks or technology conglomerates, or even the government. It would be safe, it would be secure, it would be free. He called it Bitcoin. As the first transactions were recorded, rumors about the true identity of its creator began circulating, and suspicions only increased as more people joined the cryptocurrency revolution. It wasn't long before someone brought up a compelling candidate for Satoshi, Len Sassaman. Now, there's no way to know for certain if Len Sassaman was Satoshi Nakamoto. In fact, the theory is nowhere near conclusive. But here's what we do know. Firstly, many people regard the Bitcoin source code as a work of genius, something that only someone with the deepest knowledge of privacy protocols and encryption could have created. Whoever built Bitcoin really knew what they were doing. Secondly, we also know that Bitcoin works in a similar way to some of the tools Len built. It uses a similar encryption algorithm to Pretty Good Privacy, the technology Len helped develop while he worked at Network Associates. And like Mixmaster, Bitcoin uses multiple nodes to stay decentralized. Thirdly, Satoshi regularly posted on Bitcoin forums, answering questions and sharing incredibly detailed knowledge about this novel form of currency. He was particularly active during holidays and the summertime, almost a type of schedule a student would keep if they were juggling academic work, which Len was. He was getting a PhD in Belgium at the time. But perhaps what was most remarkable about Satoshi was their ability to remain anonymous. Only someone like Len, who had expert-level knowledge of privacy, would have been able to communicate for years without leaving a trace. Satoshi Nakamoto's real identity remains a mystery, just how he wanted it. Now, Len never really shared much about his opinion on Bitcoin, and whenever he did, it seemed like he wasn't a big fan. That, in a way, goes against the theory that he's Satoshi. Or perhaps, it's just a distraction. Either way, whoever was behind Bitcoin obviously had a great deal of respect for Len. And why wouldn't they? Len was the living embodiment of Bitcoin's core principles: privacy, decentralization, and resistance to surveillance. After Len passed away, his picture was coded into Bitcoin's blockchain with an inscription that says, "Len was our friend, a brilliant mind, a kind soul, and a devious schemer." And as for Satoshi, his account has gone dark, and he hasn't been heard from since quite a long time ago, 2011 to be exact, just 2 months before Len passed away. What do you think? Is he really the creator of Bitcoin? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed learning about Len Sassaman's fight for digital freedom, you're definitely going to enjoy our episode about Phil Salen, the original visionary behind the Cypherpunk movement. It's a crazy story, and you can watch it by clicking the video on screen right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.